Okay, so tonight I will be talking about Olivia Slocum Sage. So a little bit different from some of our other programs, as she was pertinent specifically to Sag Harbor. So the focus is off of East Hampton for tonight. But also, I will also be talking about a lot of her other activities. She was a really big philanthropist outside of this community, and she was also really big, really big in activism. She worked a lot with the women's suffrage movement. So there's going to be some other interesting things that take us to New York City and to Syracuse and to Troy. So we're going to go a lot of different places tonight. Okay, so. All right. So Olivia Sage, born Margaret Olivia Slocum, she went by the name Olivia, not Margaret, so that's how we will refer to her tonight. She would likely be displeased with the title of this talk. Or if not displeased, she would perhaps just suggest a minor change. Why not call the presentation Mrs. Russell Sage? This was how she referred to herself after she married Russell, and she frequently named things after her husband rather than after herself. Two of her largest projects, Russell Sage College and the Russell Sage Foundation, were named for her husband. Of course, the Russell Sage Foundation has remained a prominent institution since its founding. And she did name one thing after herself. She named, it's called the Olivia Sage Syracuse Teachers Organization, or Teachers College. So she named one institution after herself in her entire life. That's the only one. Everything else gets Russell's name or, the names of her family members, male and female family members. But so I just thought, it would be nice if we just focus on Olivia for this moment. Of course, there's nothing wrong with her decision to use her husband's name and to name things after him. Feminism, of course, is simply about a woman's desire to choose. But as a rule, I don't like to use a husband's name when discussing a wife's accomplishments, because after a while it seems as if we cannot say anything about what she did without giving him some of the credit. And this case is a bit tricky because her husband deserves, a mountain of credit for the philanthropy done by his wife in his name, and also perhaps none of it. It was Russell, after all, who made the $73 million that he left his wife, and it was his decision to leave her the bulk of the money, rather than splitting his estate up into smaller portions. But as the couple had no children, one wonders who else it could have been left to. For Russell was not philanthropic himself, not in the least. Almost all of the contributions he made during his lifetime seem to have been coaxed out of him by his wife. He did not like to spend money on anything. Olivia often had to beg friends for tickets to get box seats at the opera, because she obviously couldn't get a cheap seat and sit out with the masses, so that wouldn't have been appropriate. And his parsimoniousness extended to philanthropy. He really did not want to give money to anybody. So I really think that, his name has already been sort of preserved in the Russell Sage Foundation. We already, if you know anything about that, you already have him as a figure in your mind. But tonight I would like you to leave thinking about Olivia, not about Russell. Okay. So, Olivia's connection to Sag Harbor is via her maternal grandmother, Margaret Pearson of Bridgehampton. Now, Margaret Pearson was married to Major John Germain, who you probably all recognize that name. His, sort of crowning accomplishment that we all know him for is that in the War of 1812, he commanded the fort at Sag Harbor. So that is how Olivia is connected to this community. And this is her mother. So Olivia was born on September 8th, 1828 in Syracuse. This is her mother, Margaret Pearson Jermaine, who was born in 1804. Now, Olivia and her mother had a very close relationship, but close in the sense that Olivia looked up to her mother. She was a guiding figure in Olivia's life. Olivia described her often as being a perfect housekeeper and a perfect gentlewoman. She was the moral authority in the household that Olivia aspired to achieve. But her mother was also strict and did not approve of Olivia's somewhat boisterous and rowdy nature as a young woman. Her mother made sure that the boundaries of class and race were impressed upon Olivia from a young age. And as Ruth Crocker points out in this wonderful biography that she published about 10 years ago, snobbery coexisted with piety. And we can kind of think of this phrase as really characterizing Olivia's entire life and involvement with philanthropy. Snobbery coexisted with piety. So this moralistic upbringing certainly became part of the reason of why Olivia was so philanthropic later in life, but it's also why in certain areas her philanthropy remains rather narrow in scope. She remained constrained by notions of class for virtually her entire life, and she especially remained constrained by this problem of class, but also how it intersected with wealth, in that she was a person who achieves class and education sort of early on in her life, but doesn't necessarily have the money to back it up. And then when she gets married to a multimillionaire, she's thrust into this whole other part of society. So there's some very interesting things going on that sort of influence who she chooses to give money to later on in life. So she's sort of just unable to escape the feeling that she's better than some people based on her birth and also based on her education. But we still, that's not to say that her charity was not important, and that's not to say that her mother did not have, a good influence on her daughter, because I don't think that Olivia would have been, the way that she was if she hadn't had the type of upbringing that she did. So this is her father, Joseph Slocum of Rensselaer County in New York State. And Olivia had sort of I imagine that it wasn't the best relationship with her father, particularly because he ran into some business troubles later in life, which we will talk about. But he basically made his money working in Syracuse. He was one of the first people to acquire a line of boats on the Erie Canal, so that was very lucrative for him at first. And then he also acquired other land and business in Syracuse, and that was how he made his money. But as I said, he ran into business troubles, and when she was 9 in 1837, the tonnage prices on the Erie Canal dropped rapidly, and many families lost their livelihoods. So I'm sure that Olivia knew other people who were of her class and then in a similar situation as she was, suddenly thrust into, not abject poverty, but I remember reading one thing about how the family could no longer keep a servant, and that was like horrible for them. It's like, okay, well, you have it better than some people. So after the loss of this fortune, the Slocums struggled financially essentially until Olivia married Russell. And so this hardship affected her into her mid to late 30s. So it she never really got past it, and she was an adult woman still struggling financially. So, let's see. She had one brother, Joseph Germain Slocum. I don't really have any time to talk about him, but apparently he was decidedly less intelligent and accomplished than his sister. But she did leave him a large sum of money, so it all worked out for him in the end. So this is a picture of Olivia in about 1850. So her education was the other great influence on her, aside from her mother. She was taught at home, and then she went to private schools in Syracuse. And at the age of 18, in 1846, she began attending the Emma Willard School, which was then known as the Troy Female Seminary, located, of course, in Troy, New York. Olivia's aunt and uncle were paying her tuition because, as we know, Olivia's family doesn't have any money at this point, so they could not pay her tuition. But her aunt and uncle provided the $350 tuition fee. Over their niece's protests that was too expensive. The Troy Female Seminary had a reputation for catering to the wealthy, and that made it a more attractive choice in the eyes of her family than a school like Mount Holyoke, which I guess tried to cater to women who couldn't pay $350 a year. So Olivia would have been with different students, different peers if she had gone to Mount Holyoke than who she ended up being with at Troy Female Seminary. So the education she received only served to encourage class snobbishness, and as I've already discussed, she was already a bit snobbish, so this education only furthered that. She attended with her cousin, who was quite a few years younger than her, maybe about 14 or 15, and they lived at the home of Olivia's aunt and uncle. So the school, which was founded by Emma Willard in 1821, was essentially a college, despite the fact that it did not call itself one. This was a conscious choice that Emma Willard made because at the time there were no colleges that accepted female students. So I think that Emma Willard, her feminism is quite interesting in this period because she's obviously trying to make the notion of women's higher education more palatable. And so she doesn't want to say, this is a college, we can do exactly the same things that men do, we can sort of elevate ourselves to their status. She's saying, oh no, we'll just have our Troy Female Seminary and it's not a college and we don't want to make it a college. However, it essentially was a college. It was probably the best education that Olivia could have gotten at the time as a woman. So while she was there, she took courses in science, anatomy, modern languages, and philosophy, as well as many others. The only courses that the Troy Female Seminary did not teach was higher level geometry and ancient Greek. So other than those two really important subjects, girls were getting a really rounded education. So this is Emma Willard. And Olivia formed close bonds with her teachers and classmates, some of who she remained in contact with. But I think probably the most important thing that comes out of her education is her connection with Emma Willard. So Olivia idolizes Emma in a similar way that she idolized her mother. So she idolizes Emma Willard's model of femininity and feminism, which was one that emphasized, again, as Ruth Crocker notes, performance, public activity, and moral authority. In other words, how a woman presented herself to society was as important as her internal moral character. And if you're not displaying your morality, if you're not doing things in a public space that show that you have this goodness of character, not that it doesn't matter, but it becomes less important. So you can politicize moral goodness, and you can politicize these traits, these traditional feminine traits that we, piety, etc., if you're performing them in a public space. So it simultaneously allowed women to be active in a public space in a way that before this moment in time they weren't very active in, while maintaining their feminine attributes. And so this idea becomes really important basically for Olivia's entire life, and we see it crop up again in the suffrage movement, which I will discuss later on. And Willard managed to be both feminine in appearance, but also powerful in her advocacy. And it's important for the importance of women's roles in public life. She was, in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's words, a queen. But it's important to note that Willard's version of feminism and Victorian-era feminism in general was full of contradictions. And I think we can still see some of these contradictions in feminism today. I don't think that they're unique to the period. But it attempted to both reinforce a woman's traditional role as the moral conscience of the household, while simultaneously trying to subvert these roles by placing women in positions of public power. And so the focus ends up being on, it doesn't appear to be a direct contradiction, but then I think when you look at it more deeply, you realize that, well, if you're only allowing women to present this traditional model of femininity and that they have to maintain that, whether they are in the home or in a more political public space, what happens to women who don't fit traditional models of femininity? How do they act in a public space? Do they get cast to the side as radicals, as trying to act like men? So we see that this version of feminism that Olivia really put a lot of stock in, we see that it's very narrow and it only includes a certain type of woman. A woman probably of Olivia's class and wealth and standing, one such as Emma Willard. So it's not feminism that includes everybody. Okay. And so this is another photo of Olivia after she graduated and became a teacher. So despite Olivia's despite the fact how much she loved Emma Willard and how much she liked this traditional idea of femininity, she made an interesting choice after graduation. Rather than decide to marry and lose her independence, she decided to earn a living for herself. Now, Troy Female Seminary was often a school where the women went, they became educated, and then they were ready to become the wives of prominent men. They had the education that they needed in order to support whatever husband they chose. And Olivia decided not to do that. She was briefly engaged to a Mr. Foster, but she ended up turning him down. And I couldn't really find an explanation for why, but I guess it's just because her parents weren't really pushing her to get married, and she didn't really like him that much, so she just thought, well, it's not worth marrying this person if I'm going to lose my independence. And she was only 18 or 19 when she graduated from school. She only went there for a year, so she was young and probably just wanted to do her own thing, and that's exactly what she did. So she returned home, however, to a family that was undergoing more financial hardship as her father's business deals abroad kept failing. They could no longer afford a servant and had mortgaged both of their houses and the family store. As her father engaged in business deals abroad that kept failing, Olivia turned to teaching. She began working at the St. Paul Schools for Girls in 1852 as one of 3 teachers there. She was paid $350 a year, and though this increased a bit when she became the assistant principal, she still felt as if it was not enough money to live comfortably on. She remained bitter about the low salary that she received teaching for her entire life, and one wonders if she had been paid more, perhaps she would have done that for longer and not married and not done all this philanthropy. Perhaps she would have remained a teacher, which is philanthropy in itself. So it was very difficult, and eventually she moved on from the St. Paul's School to the Chestnut Street Female Seminary in Philadelphia. Despite the hardships, despite the long hours and the low pay, she did really enjoy it, and she enjoyed having her independence and making decisions for herself. However, it eventually became too difficult for her to manage, especially she was going through a decline in health, and so between 1855 and 1858 she gave up teaching. Neither her father nor her brother were capable of supporting her, and the family did not even have a home that she could stay in. Her mother had fled the family home and had been staying with relatives and friends, and for a while Olivia did the same. Now, we know that Olivia really placed stock in these traditional family values, so you can only think of how sort of psychologically damaging it was to see her mother, who's this model of feminine grace and piety and a good housekeeper and a perfect gentlewoman, and she's sort of has to flee her own home without her husband to support her. So one just wonders how much of an impact that had on Olivia and the choices that she made later on. Now, so this is her future husband, Russell Sage. And while Olivia is struggling financially, he is not. So her husband was in part responsible for Olivia's father's downfall in business. In 1849, Joseph Slocum had gone into business with Russell Sage and Alexander Mitchell in a commission business in Milwaukee. But in 1853, Sage swindled Slocum out of a $100,000 sale. Slocum only ever saw about $10,000 of that. He missed out big time. The case was taken to court, but it dragged on, and eventually a lower court found that Sage had in fact swindled his own business partners. But obviously that did not impede his rise to success as a railroad tycoon. Without being able to rely on money from her family and not having found... Basically, Russell is swindling her money out of, swindling money from Olivia's father, and Olivia is still poor, and during the Civil War, she worked as a teacher and a governess and also helped in the war effort in whatever way she could, whether that be working at the hospital, playing piano for soldiers. She tried to help as much as possible. Her father died in 1862, and that was significantly... that caused her considerable grief. While all this was occurring, Russell Sage, again, his business was booming. So he was a prominent member of Troy's community, and they likely met for the first time in Troy while she was still living there. So he served on the city council, he served as a treasurer, and then he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1853 as a Whig. His business was railroads, and though this was how he made his money, it also became the reason that the town of Troy turned against him. He advised that the city sell the Schenectady-Troy Railroad to the president of the Hudson River Railroad Company, Edwin D. Morgan. Morgan sold it to the New York Central Railroad Company, a company both Sage and Morgan were directors of. Sage had essentially advised his constituents to sell him the railroad, using his public office to make private money. So, yeah, so that's relevant. And so Russell was much different from Olivia. He didn't really seem to care about how he got his money, although I can't really figure out why he cared so much about making it, since he didn't care about spending it. I mean, they didn't have like all these beautiful mansions. They didn't go on crazy vacations. He just seemed to want to hoard his money. It's strange, but so anyway, Olivia married Russell, and sorry, some of my notes seem to have gotten lost, and I don't have all of them, so that's fine. I have it basically memorized. But anyway, so you can obviously see why Olivia's family would be a little bit upset about the two of them marrying, because Sage had contributed to Joseph Slocum's financial downfall. And Sage actually, he was not on the market until 1867 because he had a wife before Olivia who he apparently really loved. However, she died 4 years after they were married of cancer. And Olivia, like I mentioned, Olivia and Russell likely met while Olivia was living in Troy. One of Olivia's uncles, Hiram, was business partners with Russell. And so they likely reconnected in that way. By 1869, both Olivia's father and Olivia's other uncle, Sylvanus, had died. So that was all effective, anything blocking their marriage had died, to put it crassly. And so they got married on November 24th, 1869. Olivia's mother, we can imagine, was not happy about this. However, it did mean that she no longer had to live with her brother, because when Olivia and Russell moved to New York, Olivia's mother went with them. Marrying Russell Sage meant that for the first time in Olivia's life, she had true financial independence. Maybe that's not the best way to put it. Financial comfort, which she had never had before. She had never really had someone who was always going to provide for her, and there was no way that they were going to eat $73 million worth of money, so she was set. But it also meant that her choices were not her own for the first time in her life. She had to become Mrs. Russell Sage. She had to take on all these new responsibilities as his wife and make a name for herself in New York society, New York City society. And so we can imagine that that must have been difficult for her, but I think it's something that she really committed herself to right away, and she got involved with many, many different projects. And I think that despite the fact that because he really didn't let her spend any money, she actually wrote quite a bit later in life about how she believed it was a husband's job to provide his wife with an allowance if she couldn't work. And I was like, all right, I get it. You're mad. But anyway, so he was not giving her an allowance, and that frustrated her. But she managed to contribute to activism and make a name for herself in philanthropy before she was even able to give large sums of money. One of the first institutions that Olivia became involved in was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I hesitate to call it true charity because Indian reform schools, as we now know, have sordid histories. So the Carlisle School had been founded by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879. The school appealed to Olivia because its mission was the civilization and assimilation of indigenous peoples into white society. Once this had happened, they would be accorded all of the rights that whites had. Ruth Crocker notes that Olivia, as someone who had been raised in a home that saw the breakdown of traditional family values, her father had been unable to support them, and her mother had fled the family home. Olivia was someone who was interested in seeing the American Indian people become women and men in the traditional sense of the word. So in other words, she couldn't have those traditional values broke down in her own family, and it became important to her to see those things play out for other people, work out for other people. It's quite strange, but I think it does make sense when you think about she couldn't achieve it, maybe she could help other people achieve it. So some of the work Olivia did for Carlisle was done through the Women's Union Missionary Society of America for Heathen Lands. She was the head of its executive committee. Her work with this committee included sponsoring a trip for 140 students to Philadelphia, New York City, and Brooklyn. She also donated small sums of money to the school and apparently persuaded Russell to pay for 40 students to attend. Russell and Olivia became close friends with the Pratts and remained concerned with Indigenous rights. However, Russell was partly responsible, or even largely responsible, as a businessman with a vested interest in expansion, because remember, he did railroads. He was responsible in part for the destruction of the Plains Indians. I think one of his colleagues actually said that the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the best things to have happened for their business because it meant the utter destruction of the Plains Indians. So there's a huge contradiction going on in, or maybe not a contradiction, but basically, Olivia apparently sort of tried to support American Indian rights at the same time as her husband was actively destroying their land with his business. So there's a lot going on there. So the writer Zikala Sa, who had attended another Native American reform school as a young girl and had briefly taught at Carlisle, wrote about the difficulties of coming home from reform school and no longer being able to connect to or participate in tribal culture. Of course, American Indians who graduated from Carlisle School and others like it were not accorded the same rights as whites were. One can easily argue that they are still not, and we now know that this type of charity work that was apparently done at Carlisle was detrimental to the students because, I mean, first of all, of the thousands of students who attended Carlisle, I think the number of who graduated is like 200 or something. Not many students actually graduated from the school. And though it did attempt to teach them useful skills, it was about making them white, and they, in many instances, very young children went to this school and they were forced to cut their hair, which could be very traumatic depending on what tribe they had come from, because the significance, I'm not an expert, so I don't know the exact significance of hair in each culture, but it's something that comes up again and again when you research this, is that was, you could hear people crying at these schools because of the things that they were forced to, the parts of their identity they were forced to erase. And they couldn't speak their own language. And then when they went back to their own tribes, they had no way of connecting with their tribal roots because they had been taken off reservations or off their land when they were 10 and then sent back, and somehow it just sort of leads to this blurred identity or this sort of not knowing where you belong. And Zikala Sa, who's on the screen right now, I encourage everybody to check out her work because she is very interesting in that she sort of politicizes her identity as a Native American woman. I think her father was white and her mother was Native American, I always forget. But so she politicizes her identity and takes her experience at a reform school and uses it to tell her stories and make them palatable for a white audience, but also, educate her audience. So she's a very interesting character. So Olivia's interest and charity to Carlisle helps highlight something that plagued her philanthropy for her entire life. Her concern with doing the correct thing, morally and socially, was often at odds with what the right thing to do for people actually was. And I think that's something that that's not unique to her, and that doesn't negate her good philanthropy that she did. I don't mean to just sort of tear her down. I'm going to say some nice things about her in a moment. But she was just painfully concerned with class and societal standing, and this influenced her charity work. It's also important to note that the type of feminism and charity work that Olivia often participated in was exclusively for white women and came at the expense of Black women and Indigenous women. And we see this not only in Olivia's work at the Carlisle School, but her work at the Women's Hospital of New York, which I can't go into because it would just take way too much time, but I encourage you to look into it because it's very interesting, and you see that it really does come at the expense of Black women. Great. Okay, so this tension becomes apparent in her support of women's suffrage, which was at times fervent and wholehearted, but then later in life became a bit reluctant. Olivia became friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the leaders of the suffrage movement. They were both graduates of the Troy Female Seminary, and in 1893, Stanton wrote in her diary that Mrs. Sage has just been converted to women's suffrage, and she tells me that she is drawing Mr. Sage in the right direction. And Russell, for all of his, he doesn't seem like that great of a guy, but he does throw his support behind women's suffrage. So you can imagine that, I guess Olivia had a bit of an influence on him, a good influence. And so in 1894, Olivia gave an interview supporting women's suffrage and expressing her desire for these women who paid taxes to be able to vote and thus purify politics. And that it was not about the way that they frame suffrage at this moment in time has a lot to do with this purifying politics and a woman's influence and how good that could be and how that should extend not just to the home life and not just to these spaces that traditionally women were allowed to exist in, but that needed to extend to the ballot as well. So they were not trying to say, we are men and we should be able to vote because we have the same intelligence and same qualities as men. They were actually saying, no, we should be able to vote because we can do things differently than men, and in some cases we will do things better than men will do them, and that's why you should let us vote. So Olivia's support of suffrage was in part because of the fact that the suffrage movement had reframed itself as a movement for the educated woman and the educated vote. This appealed to Olivia and meant that supporting suffrage was not as much of a social risk as it could have been. It also allowed her to identify personally with the movement, because you'll remember that her education was extremely important to her and she had been a teacher. So educating women and educating just people in general was something she took very seriously. And so if you reframe it as the vote for the educated woman, she and others like her were able to connect with the movement. And it stopped it from being sort of like a fringe radical movement. It made feminism more palatable and drew wealthy women who were prominent in society and were necessary for the advancement of suffrage. It drew them to the movement. So while it is elitist, you also see why it's necessary, and how women at this point in time, I think especially in New York, were just trying to do anything that they could to get suffrage passed. Olivia became involved in parlor suffrage, which is what you see depicted on the screen. So this is actually a cartoon of a political meeting that Olivia hosted at her house. So that is in 1894, and about 200 women were in attendance, and Olivia gave a great speech about it. So basically, by hosting these meetings in the home, Olivia and others like her were able to bring activism into the domestic sphere and also help keep suffrage from becoming viewed as radical, for the home was a woman's dominion, and it made sense for her to preside over it. So this is one of the main ways that Olivia gets involved in women's suffrage, is by holding these political meetings and by speaking about why women needed suffrage, again, the purity of the vote, purifying the vote. There were some critics of this movement when it was happening. I think sometimes they were called like gilt chair suffragettes or something, because they're only you couldn't obtain an invitation to this as a regular working class woman. You had to be wealthy. However, again, I've already spoken about why it was necessary for these meetings to be held in the way that they were, and it helped women politicize the domestic sphere that they were traditionally allowed to exist in. Olivia continued to support the movement after, so basically, she was involved mainly with trying to get suffrage passed in New York State, but it failed in 1894, and she still remained committed to the movement, and she still remained very involved. I don't have the exact date of when this happened because I don't have the rest of my notes with me, but a little bit later, I think about 1905, there was sort of this incident that isn't really talked about, but essentially they were trying to elect a new chair of the National Women's Suffrage Committee. I don't remember the acronym exactly. So they're trying to elect a new chair, and essentially Olivia backed the wrong person. She threw her support behind the wrong woman, and it sort of, you know, meant that after that she didn't really have that much influence in the movement, and sort of backed off trying to really change things. Susan B. Anthony still encouraged her to participate, and actually sort of made the case that it was Olivia's duty as a wealthy woman with the means to support the movement, was her duty to actually support it. And I think Olivia kind of took that to heart, but when she actually had the means to support the suffrage movement, after she inherited her husband's money, she was a bit reluctant to do so. It's quite strange. So she had to sort of be coerced or begged to just pay their rent in New York, and it was a rent that was a drop in the bucket for her $73 million, but I don't know if that just has to do with the fact that she was spending the money in her husband's name and what she wanted to associate him with. That seems most likely to me, and also she didn't really know the leaders of the suffrage movement at that point in time. She fell out of touch with it, so she likely just felt disconnected from it, and like she couldn't personally identify with it, because it did become a bit more radical by that time, so it may have not as been appealing to her as this parlor suffrage was. Okay, so I've merely just highlighted 2 instances of Olivia's activism before her husband's death, and I encourage you to research her other endeavors, which included work at the Women's Hospital in New York City, work at the Emma Willard Association, and work at the New York Exchange for Women's Work. But now I kind of have to turn to Sag Harbor so that we don't run out of time. But Russell died in 1906 at the age of 90. Olivia was 78. In his will, he left her almost all of his money, around $73 million, which amounted to about $1.5 billion in 2004 currency. So I'm not good at math, so I don't know how much that is today, but it's a lot of money. So the death of her husband and the money she inherited gave Olivia something she had always longed for: true financial independence. Not just financial comfort, not just knowing that she would always have a place to live and be fed, but true financial independence. She could do whatever she wanted with her money. She hadn't had this as a young woman, living off of charity and her meager teacher's salary, nor had she had it when she was married to Russell, because he didn't give her an allowance. So she wasn't able to do all of this charity that she really wanted to do while he was alive. I think she said, it feels as if I'm alive for the first time. So one wonders about their marriage, but that's not the focus of this talk. So the inheritance also allowed her to rewrite Russell's reputation and the Sage family name, which she was now connected to. He was viewed publicly as a no-good miser. Olivia felt strongly about changing this, not only because of her own personal commitment to charity, but also because of her fondness for her husband. She had a genealogy book about the Sage and Slocum families put together in 1908. The clipping on the screen is from the first chapter of the book and frames Russell as a self-made man, financial genius, and impressive figure. It was clear that Olivia wanted the world to remember her husband in a particular manner. And she had encouraged him to give money while he was alive, and in some cases she had been successful. One wonders if he left her the sum of $73 million, knowing that she would end up giving all of it away. I mean, I don't know what else he expected her to do with it. She was 78. She wasn't going to spend all of that in the last years of her life, so I mean, he probably could have figured it out. He obviously knew his wife fairly well and knew what she was involved with. So in leaving Olivia $73 million, Russell left $73 million to charity. So that's probably one of the better things you can say about him. Almost immediately after inheriting the money, she began receiving 300 letters or more a day asking for money, because I guess she had already built herself up as this figure of philanthropy and had started trying to give money away as he was like 88 and 89. She was trying to do what she wanted with it. And so people kind of knew that she was going to use it for charity, and so she got 300 letters a day begging for money. So she had to hire someone to help her with it. On the screen is Robert Weeks DeForest, who she did hire to help her sort through the letters and determine what causes she should give it to. She employed 2 other women who helped her. One of them, I hate that her name is slipping my mind, but one of the women Olivia employed later in life actually had been an inventor and an engineer who built an airplane. And so that's how Olivia got involved with, I don't know. There's much more to be said about all of this that I can't include in my talk. I could spend an hour talking about this man's involvement in the Sage Fund, as he called it. But he basically just played the role of the gatekeeper. And I sort of wonder if her philanthropy would have been different had he not been the gatekeeper, because you basically couldn't get to Olivia without writing to him. And he had a specific set of things. He was a true progressive era reformer, so he had a specific set of things he wanted to give money to. And I wonder if later in life, when Olivia was really old, if he had sort of undue influence over what was going on. But again, a topic for another time. So some of her before I go on to Sag Harbor, finally, some of her most notable projects include the Russell Sage Foundation, which she established with $10 million and continues to be at the forefront of research in the social sciences. She gave several large gifts to universities. She established the Russell Sage College, which was a college for women. And she gave a lot of money to the Forest Hills Gardens in Queens. That was one of her largest donations. And that is another really interesting project of hers that I wish I had more time to talk about. But let us now turn to Sag Harbor and Olivia's philanthropy there. So you'll remember that she had a connection to the area via her mother, whose father was John Germain. And whose mother was Margaret Pearson. This is John Germain himself, and this is his home. In September 1901, the Sag Harbor Corrector notes that Olivia had purchased the colonial home of John Germain on Main Street and restored it. So this was something she did before her husband died. I think she may have given this as a gift to Russell, or they were going to use it as a summer home. I don't remember, but this is something that happens before her significant philanthropy in Sag Harbor. She already is starting to build this connection to the community in 1901. And so after she was widowed, she purchased another property in 1908. This is the Hunting House, and she paid $40,000 for it. It's the home in which the Sag Harbor Whaling Museum now resides, and it's right across the street from the John Germain Library. So this is the start of Olivia's time in Sag Harbor. It's 1908. And so she's really only very active in the community for about 4 years. This is what Sag Harbor looked like circa 1895. And most of these photos that I am showing you of Sag Harbor I got from the John Germain Library, which they were very helpful in getting all these together for me. So they have an interesting and large collection of photos of old Sag Harbor. So I would encourage anybody interested to go take a look. But like I said, this is circa 1895. So her philanthropy left its mark on Sag Harbor, despite the fact that she was really only there for about 4 summers between 1908 and 1912. Okay, so though some residents took issue with the changes that she tried to enact and the changes that she did enact, it seems as if the local papers, at least, were always firmly on her side during the 4 years in which she played the role of Sag Harbor's Lady Bountiful. So you can see this amusing and pertinent quote about paying taxes. And this is from a March 1908 edition of the Corrector. Okay, so this is a photo of the pharmacy, and sort of on the very left, well, my left, so your right, I guess, is William Wallace Tooker. He's the man standing sort of lower than the other 2 men. And so he became one of her ongoing projects, and one of her sort of most interesting projects, I think. Maybe not her biggest, but it was certainly very interesting. So she was aiding him in his research, and because he was a local scholar, he was compiling research for a book called Indian Place Names of Long Island. So Olivia clearly retained her interest in American Indian affairs into her later life, as she decided to, one of the first things she did during her time in Sag Harbor was support William Wallace Tooker. So she had been acquainted with Tooker before she became widowed, and he is named as her agent in the Sag Harbor Corrector in 1905. He was known during his time as one of the most prominent scholars of coastal Algonquin culture and artifacts. Interestingly, he had no formal training, and his day job, so to speak, was as the pharmacist. This book, which he published in 1911, would likely have not been possible without his benefactress, because in 1911, Tooker would have been 64, and his health had been failing him for many years. But he had to quit being a pharmacist, and he was quite poor and unable to work, and he really wanted to finish his research, and Olivia was the person who helped him. So she just paid for an assistant to help him conduct his research and to whom he could dictate the manuscript so that he could actually get it all done. So it was finally finished in 1911, and it was a 300-page book that has remained important in the field of Algonquin etymology. Apparently, I don't know that much about Algonquin etymology, so I guess it's remained important. And he dedicated the book to Olivia Sage. So I really liked this sort of charming aspect of her philanthropy, which was like helping individual people when she saw a need. You know, she didn't just focus on these big projects, at least not in Sag Harbor, but she focused sometimes just on individuals, people who needed her help, and he was a person who really needed her help, and without her, you know, his research wouldn't have been published. So, okay. So this is the first of her large projects in Sag Harbor. So in addition to the homes she restored, she gave the town 2 significant buildings that still stand today. The first of these, Pearson High School, she helped restore many other buildings, but she built 2 very significant ones. The first of these was Pearson High School and was completed in, well, I saw the date as 1908, but I think it's actually completed in 1909 because that was the date given on many of the photos that I looked at the John Germain Library, so 1908 or 1909, I'm not positive. But it was completed for $102,000. I think we can understand Olivia's interest in building Sag Harbor a high school very easily, because reforming education at the local level was an important aspect of progressivism. And we must remember that education was also extremely important to her. So we can see this first progressive project of hers to sort of redirect the community meeting places and redirect community energy towards these appropriate public gathering places, I guess is a good way to put it. There was some issue over naming Pearson High School. It was thought at first that it would be called Sag Harbor High School, and then residents were a bit angered when they heard that it would be named for Olivia's ancestors. She clarified by writing to the local papers, stating that, "I wanted the school to have the name Pearson, not because of my ancestry, but because of Henry Pearson, who was one of the founders of the present common school system in this country." Who knows how she truly decided to name the school. I think it actually just fits that it could be Pearson, her ancestors, or Pearson, Henry Pearson, and that was a way for her to clarify it to the residents of Sag Harbor. Another source lists that she did in fact name the school for her ancestor, Abraham Pearson, who helped found Yale University. So Olivia I sort of think that she probably was just naming it for her ancestors because she, as I already mentioned briefly, she had a vested interest in genealogy, and she had a book published about her own family's genealogy, and she really wanted to be able to trace her family back to, you know, the Mayflower and further in England. So I think she probably really enjoyed the fact that she had an ancestor who was connected to the founding of Yale University. And it makes sense that you would name a school after someone who founded a school. So, okay, so this is the lane of the cornerstone for Pearson High School. You can see that it's kind of like a big celebration, lots of people out. So Olivia continued to be generous to the school even after it was built. In 1910, she paid for the Thanksgiving festivities at the school, which included an orchestra performance, a magician, ice cream and cake, and a box of chocolates for each student that they found on their desk when they came back from watching the performance. So again, her philanthropy is quite charming. I mean, she's not moving mountains, but she's making sure that every kid gets, you know, every single child getting a box of chocolates. So it's quite nice. And So the second great public building that Olivia was responsible for was the John Germain Library, which clearly was named for her ancestor, the one the residents liked more than any Pearson. It was completed in 1910 and cost around $75,000. It initially had around 5,000 books, though that number increased shortly after, because I believe Olivia continued to give them money and books after her initial donations. So the library was across the street from her house, the hunting house, and it's still there today. And this is just a really neat view, I thought, of what she would have seen. You know, this is how she would have looked at the library from her residence at the hunting house when she was there over the summer. So the library actually, still today, it looks amazing, and they did a really good restoration job on the inside of the dome. It's so beautiful. And so this is an older photo. I don't remember the date on this photo. Certainly it's newer than when the library was built, but so this is what it would have looked like. And you know, it kind of went through different periods, but it looks very much like this today. They've done a really good job on keeping the furniture the same, the lamps, you know, bringing out the sort of the colors in the dome are sort of this nice orangey coral. So it's it's just beautiful, and it sort of stands as a legacy to Olivia and what she was able to accomplish. So now we're going to talk about Massachusetts Park. So this is maybe the largest of Olivia's projects, perhaps not monetarily, but just in scope and I think what she wanted to accomplish with it. So she converted the fairgrounds into Massachusetts Park. She purchased the land for $5,000 during the summer of 1908. Tooker was responsible for the name of the park, which in Algonquin means place of great springs. The area had, in 1879, been fitted with a half-mile racing track and exhibition spaces for poultry, flowers, produce, baked goods, and the like. Well, by the time Olivia got to town, the fairgrounds were fairly dilapidated, and she decided that she wanted to turn it into a public park and playground. The Express aptly noted that she was to transform the space from a pleasure grounds into a place of usefulness. For Olivia did not want to encourage the revelry that came with the races and the uncontrolled environment of the fairgrounds. She wanted to encourage appropriate public gathering. This is perhaps why she runs into some issues. I don't know if people felt maybe that the changes she made were sometimes undemocratic, but anyway, so she employed the New York architectural firm of Samuel Parsons to design it, and it was meant to be scientific in design, including all the latest equipment and amenities. Modernization and making things efficient was another aspect of progressivism that Olivia really enjoyed, and so with the park, she was able to see the culmination of two progressive era ideas. It was both a place for useful and appropriate public gathering and would thus positively affect the community and redirect and revive the energy into sort of a positive area rather than it being, because you have to, you know, imagine this is sort of at the same time as the temperance movement, so, which Olivia wasn't heavily involved in, but it certainly did influence her, I think. So you have to imagine why she would have wanted a public park and playground rather than a racetrack and a fairgrounds or something like a beer hall. This was obviously more up her alley. And it was both, so it had not only been designed with appropriate public gathering in mind, but it was also designed with modernity. So it was sort of this culmination of these progressive values that Olivia really tried to adhere to in her philanthropy. But despite all that, one cannot deny that the park had a positive effect on the community. An early form of community gardening was encouraged, with 114 plots for children to till made available. Baseball, tennis, and track and field events took place. You can see that this picture of the park obviously is with the athletic apparatus included, and you can see how many people were there. Attendance in the summer of 1911 was 275 people per day, so it was being used quite often, and I think it is one of sort of the best thing she did for the community, having that large of a public space. So now I just want to go through some fun photos about various activities that children engaged in. So here we have a group of young women playing croquet. Most of these images are from the early 1900s. I don't have exact dates on most of them. Yeah, so I think that's really cute. And then we also have this shepherd's dance. So I thought that this was interesting because I read somewhere that on Ruth Crocker's biography that Olivia had a hand in choosing the programming that was taking place at the park. She wanted to be involved on sort of a large level and be this Lady Bountiful figure, but she also sort of wanted to be involved with the minutia of and the details. So she sort of chose some of the programming, and apparently this included folk dancing and educational talks. So the caption that went with this image said that it was an early 1900s photo of young women performing the shepherd's dance done at Massachusetts Park. So I like to imagine that this was one of the dances that Olivia specifically chose. I don't know if that's a fact, but I'm going to make that connection.
Yeah.
And so then this is another really fun image. It was a car decorating competition held at the park, again, in the early 1900s. And for some reason, this car got second prize, and I clearly think that it's deserving of first prize, which is why I chose it, because the first prize car was not very attractive, and I just like the way that they coordinated their outfits, one color scheme. It's very nice. So that was another one of the activities that occurred in the early 1900s at the park. In 1913, so a year after Olivia ended up leaving Sag Harbor, Pearson High School students decided that they wanted a flagpole at the park. And so they each gave 10 cents to the project, though they had to earn the money for themselves, which I thought was interesting. A 70-foot pine tree was used for the pole, and the flagpole was placed at the highest point in the park. They also placed a plaque at the base of the pole that noted Mrs. Russell Sage's involvement in the park. Eventually, Olivia deeded the property to the Sage Foundation in 1917, a year before her death in 1918, and then the Sage Foundation turned it over to the Parks and Recreation Association of Sag Harbor in 1920, putting control of the park essentially in local hands, as that was a local organization. So something that Olivia, built for Sag Harbor ends up truly belonging to Sag Harbor and belonging to that community. And it's clear that she sort of made provisions for its care by deeding it to the Russell Sage Foundation so that the park would sort of never become dilapidated again, because the Russell Sage Foundation was always going to have a large amount of money to care for it. With the park, we can also talk about Otter Pond. So this was a particular bone of contention between Olivia and the residents of Sag Harbor. It was her desire to build a shore boulevard around the pond and include it as part of the park. This meant, however, that she had to move or demolish all of the houses that were around the pond. So if you are familiar at all with Sag Harbor, you'll know that this is right across the street from Massachusetts Park. This image I find a little confusing. So it's by Edward Lang, and it shows what the pond looked like, I guess, before the houses were removed, since you have all these houses, but then it also has the shore boulevard, so I don't know if maybe this is historically inaccurate. I'm not really sure. But I just think it's really neat, and I like the way that, I don't know if it's clear enough for you to see the names of each of the people, but, there's an Eldridge house in there, and there's I don't remember some of the other names, but this is at the John Germain Library, as is another one of these little maps that he did, so you can go see those there if you're interested. And eventually it was revealed or understood that Olivia moved the houses and gave them to those in need, rather than demolishing them, but at the time some residents felt as if she was just getting rid of houses left and right. One of the local papers penned an impassioned defense of her in the summer of 1911, using the headline, "Give credit where credit is due." The article states that a report has been going around the city presses that Mrs. Russell Sage has been purchasing and demolishing so many houses that there's a scarcity of tenements here, and some people have to live in hen coops, and some perhaps, for all we know, in pig pens. The paper then refutes that statement and says that the scarcity of housing is due to nothing more than an increase in population and nothing else. So it then examines thoroughly which houses Mrs. Sage had in fact demolished. None. She purchased homes and then gave them to family members and ensured that they were moved. So family members of the people who initially had owned the houses, not her own family members. Some of the houses ended up being demolished by their new owners, but we can't blame that on Olivia. And the fact remains, however, that had Olivia not wanted to include Otter Pond in her plans for the park, many of the houses would have been left alone. Although I do think that her moving the houses did lead to some of them being restored. So even though all this effort had to go in getting rid of these places that she bought up and then gave to people, I think that we can ultimately view it as positive because she was giving them to people in need, and then some of them ended up being restored because they got moved. So that's sort of one instance of her and Sag Harbor clashing a little bit, and I think that it's quite easy to see why, especially since, you know, small communities having issues with big benefactors who just come in and want to do things the way that they want to do them without asking people about their specific needs. And so I think that while for the most part, Olivia's charity was very positive for Sag Harbor, and we obviously look back at it now and know that she did all these positive things, I think it's also easy to understand why the residents and her sometimes clashed horns, so to speak, because she did just want to do things the way she wanted to do them, and wanted to cultivate this figure of Lady Bountiful of Sag Harbor, and sometimes I think she maybe felt that people weren't appreciative of her, especially if there was some negative talk in the presses. I can imagine that that would have been upsetting for her. So I have focused on the 4 largest projects that Olivia implemented in Sag Harbor, but she donated countless other sums of money. For instance, she paid for the restoration of the steeple at the old Whalers Church and donated money for band uniforms. She also gave money to the fire department so that they could purchase new fire suits. She gave money to help build the new railroad station. As a local paper notes, Olivia was good for the Sag Harbor community in general and for the economy because her money ended up in the pockets of Sag Harbor residents as she employed them in her many projects. I think that Olivia's numerous smaller donations demonstrate that she was truly interested in helping the community and residents of Sag Harbor rather than just interested in making a name for herself as this philanthropist. It's useful to note that around the time Olivia came to Sag Harbor, it had fallen sort of on difficult times due in part to the decline of the whaling industry, because in 1908 whaling isn't making that much money in the States anymore, and additionally I guess the textile factory in Sag Harbor had burned down. So Olivia came to the community wanting to bolster the economy and wanting to truly help it because I think she recognized that it did need her help. And so regardless of the squabbles that she may have had with the residents, it's clear that the things she did were actually quite good. Her larger projects were clearly aimed at progressive era reform and making places such as parks and schools the center of the community. She wanted to revive the town and direct public gathering towards these places of moral goodness and usefulness. But I think that her smaller bits of charity, and I have not listed all of them here, shows that she was invested in the community and truly did want to help. She would not make a name for herself as a progressive era philanthropist by donating money for uniforms, yet she did it anyway. Okay, so this is Olivia feeding some squirrels. I've seen more than one photo of her feeding wildlife, so it was something that she enjoyed. I'm not sure if this is Central Park, but I do know that she spent... Anyway, so why did she end up leaving the community in 1912? Ruth Crocker states that the whole episode I think the episode with Otter Pond in particular ended in recrimination, with the community in revolt against the reformers' uplift plans and with Olivia abandoning her summer home there. And in 1912, it was revealed that the contractor she had paid to build the high school had used inferior building materials than the ones she had paid for. This angered her because you can imagine that she wanted the school, education was very important to her. She would have wanted it to be the best that it could be and would have probably been quite angry that they had, not done as she directed. There were reports that the residents of Sag Harbor were unappreciative and that parts of the park had been vandalized. Perhaps the residents took issue with Olivia's undemocratic approach to reform, but either way, she did end up leaving in 1912 and she did not come back and stay another summer there. But however the residents of Sag Harbor thought of her in 1912, there is no doubt that she is now looked upon fondly as one of the community's greatest benefactresses. In 2016, she became one of the first inductees into Pearson's High School's Wall of Honor, and a recent letter that I was reading in the Sag Harbor Express entitled, "Will a New Mrs. Russell Sage Please Stand Up?" briefly detailed her commitment to helping the community in times of need, and then asked that a new philanthropist step in to aid in rebuilding the cinema. So to conclude, Olivia died in 1918, but she still had $40 million left, and her last act was to ensure that it was divided into $800,000 equal portions and donated to 52 different organizations and charities.